So you may be wondering, why doesn't the Lexus GX460 get the fancy Fox shocks that are on the Toyota 4Runner TRD Pro? In fact, why do none of Toyota's flagship SUV models, such as the Landcruiser Prado or this GX, or the full-size Landcruiser, or even the new Landcruiser 300, why doesn't that get those Fox shocks that are on the TRD 4Runner, TRD Pro 4Runner? Well, today we're going to talk about why most people will never benefit from the Fox shocks on the Toyota 4Runner TRD Pro. Jump right into it. So the 4Runner on their TRD Pro model comes with some fancy Fox shocks. Many people may be confused because the seeming top tier 4Runner comes with these fancy aftermarket Fox shocks, yet on more expensive models such as the GX or the Prado or the full-size Landcruiser, they don't have those Fox shocks. In fact, the Toyota TRD Pro is pretty much an American marketing package. Worldwide, the TRD Pro 4Runner simply isn't a thing. It's only here in America, and it gets the fancy shocks, but yet the higher end models, like this GX, don't get those Fox shocks. So what's the deal behind that? Are the Fox shocks better than this? Why isn't Toyota putting them on their new Landcruiser? What gives? All right, let's jump right into it. The bottom line is simple. Most people who off-road will never benefit from Fox shocks. I'll get to why in a second, but I just want to point out what these Fox shocks on the TRD Pro 4Runner actually do. They have reservoirs, which essentially allows them to run cooler and therefore eliminates a phenomenon known as shock fade, when you overwork the shocks and they essentially cease to work. Those are on the rear. On the front, there's also what they call internal valving, and so the valving, or internal bypass, I should say. So there's specific zones on the front that are basically different from regular shocks. So let's start with, I think, the easiest to understand, which is the rear TRD Pro shocks, which have that external reservoir on there. What's the point behind that? It's essentially like having more oil capacity, so they'll run cooler and you won't have shock fade. That's the whole point. On the fronts, you have these bypass zones, which essentially give you two extreme zones, one at the bump stop end and one at the far droop end on the opposite end of the stroke. So why hasn't Toyota put these fancy shocks on every vehicle? Well, like I said in the beginning, they're only beneficial to an extreme type of off-roader, which I will call airborne off-roaders. So note something right off the bat. When I talk about airborne off-roaders, I'm not talking about people who do easy off-roading, moderate off-roading, difficult off-roading, overlanding, or extreme rock crawling. I'm not talking about any of those most common types of off-roaders. When I say airborne off-roaders, I'm talking about Dukes of Hazzard, off-roaders that literally get airborne. Full shock droop when they go over a hill or a mound, and then full compression on the bump stops over and over and over. So this sort of Dukes of Hazzard, desert racing, when you see those fancy Baja Desert racers, or people racing in those Razors or side-by-sides or Can-Ams, that sort of thing. In addition, this type of racing or airborne off-roading has to be done over a long period of time for anybody to gain benefit from these Fox shocks. That's going to get back to this shock fade phenomenon. So most people may think that shock fade is when you go over washboard roads like we have out here. We live on washboard roads and the tires are bouncing and dancing all over the place and your tires going up and down like that. That's not shock fade. That doesn't cause shock fade. You can do that all day and all night. Shock fade doesn't happen with a high frequency, low stroke type of motion, such as washboards. You can do that for hours and days on end. Your shock oil won't overheat. Shock fade happens on the stroke. So full compression to full droop, like when you're going over these Dukes of Hazzard, flying, airborne type of stuff for a long period of time. So shock fade happens on high stroke, high frequency type of off-roading. A type of off-roading that very, very, very few people do worldwide. Who does that type of off-roading? Racers. So technically, when Toyota calls it their TRD Pro package, they're not lying. The R in TRD stands for racing. So the TRD Pro suspension with those Fox shocks are meant for people who are going to fly airborne, off-road, all day, all night for hours. Now, I don't know how your neck or body can handle that. I don't know anybody who does that, you know. But if you are the type of person that, and be honest with yourself, that you're going to literally be airborne flying for hours on end, that's the advantage of the TRD Pro package, which with its Fox shocks. You will avoid the shock fade. Now, that's not to say that your normal Tokiko shocks that are on this GX, the Prado, and the full-size Landcruiser to this day aren't amazing. They'll do all that. In fact, they'll do those whoop-de-whoops without any issues. Are most people going to do that? No, absolutely not. In fact, that type of off-roading is so rare that Toyota has decided that, hey, we're only going to make this TRD Pro shock for this niche American market that loves this airborne type of desert racing that I'm talking about, where people are flying over these whoop-de-whoops for hours and hours and hours. So it is in no world market. The African market doesn't get it. The Middle Eastern market, the Asian market, the Australian markets, they don't get this TRD Pro package because that's such a niche type of off-roading that Toyota knows, being honest with themselves, most people aren't going to do. So we said that the TRD Pro Fox shocks prevent shock fade, but only in that airborne type of off-roading scenario over long amounts of time. Be honest with yourself, you're never going to do that. So that takes care of the shock fade part. So what about the external or internal bypass valves on the front end of the TRD Pro Fox shocks? And this is where it gets a little bit subjective, and I'm simplifying this just to make it pragmatic. The front shocks essentially have 3 zones on the TRD Pro Fox shocks. Okay, you have your ride zone, and then at the extreme zone you'll have the bump stop zone, and then at the other extreme end you'll have this kind of full droop zone. And essentially, in a nutshell, on those shocks, it gives more resistance in that bump stop zone before you hit your actual bump stop. Same way on the full droop end. Now, does it make a night and day difference? That's up for you to decide. But probably not, unless, again, you're going to do airborne off-roading. That's the only benefit to this TRD Pro package insofar as the Fox shocks are concerned. There should be no concern with shock fade under normal off-roading conditions on any Toyota 4Runner with its normal Tokiko shocks. By the way, Tokiko makes the shocks on that Japanese bullet train that goes like 200 miles per hour. So they've been making shocks forever, and they're top notch. But getting back to shock fade, on your normal 4Runner or GX or Landcruiser or the new Landcruiser 300, you can have those wheels bouncing and going like crazy, high frequency, all you want on washboards. You can do all the whoop-de-whoops within reason, you know, for that most sane, normal people will do, and there will be no such thing as shock fade. you'll be A-okay. It's only if you are desert racing, doing airborne, super duper extreme off-roading. That's the only time you'll benefit from these Fox shocks. Now, any other type of off-roading, including extreme rock crawling, you can have high stroke, low frequency, you know, like when you're doing extreme articulation, the shocks don't care. And like I said, you can have washboard over and over, high frequency, low stroke. The shocks don't care. There's not going to be any shock fade. So what about those, these bypass zones? It's subjective. Toyota claims that there's something like 7 compression zones with their Fox shocks. So basically Fox is claiming that there's 7 compression zones and, I don't know, 5 rebound zones. But what's a zone, you know? I doubt there's 11 bypasses inside those Fox shocks on the front TRD Pro. What's likely is there's 2 zones, like I mentioned, that far end bump stop zone and that low end full droop zone. And all the other in-between zones are just your normal shock valving. So those shims or plates that are over the shock piston, you know, those are basically springs. Normal shocks have them, and your Fox shocks will have them. Those are just springs that, based on the velocity or speed of the bump you hit, they deflect a certain amount. So as you can see, that varies. That lets in a little bit of fluid, a lot more, a lot more, a lot more. So how many steps are they counting in the Fox shocks, you know, that they consider zones? Subjective, you know, it's a little. So I will say this. So what do these two Kikos have? Just like any other well-made shock, you're going to have those same shims in there, and you're going to have so many variations, and it's an analog variation. So the springs in there, and I'm calling the shims the springs because they act like springs, they'll deflect and let in a varying amount of fluid. If you wanted to start counting these digitally, you could say, well, these Tokikos have 25 compression zones and rebound zones. So it's getting into a little bit of semantics, the claims. As far as what you see when you crack open that Fox shock, you're not going to see 11 different ports. You're probably, again, only going to see 2 ports, and that's just that extreme bump stop and extreme droop for when you fly Dukes of Hazzard off the road. If you're not doing that, there's no advantage to that Fox shock. That's why they didn't put it on more expensive models like this GX or the Prado, same vehicle, or the old Landcruiser, full-size Landcruiser, or the brand new Landcruiser 300. It doesn't have Fox shock. It has good old Tokiko shocks like that are on this thing, because the TRD Pro is exactly what it says. It is a racing car. So if you're not desert racing, go with anything else. I'm not saying they're bad, just don't think you're missing out. That's what I want to say. Or you're somehow downgraded with the normal Lexus standard, Toyota standard Tokiko shock. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you found this video helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you, and have a great, great day.
Divided from the century of the cool cat, deep down with the clean of the hot hat, lift up face, and then they knocking on my door. I've been feeling the boom, just a little after 4. The rest of what that core was really just for. Yo, break out the sword and let's go cruising in your Ford. Watch out, yeah, sweet snow's the deal. As she shouted, it's the funky lesson 1 to the grill. I should have known that something wasn't right in walking. The biggity boom was just ticking and clocking. A night boy in plaid is passed from his dad. Another straight in the fight man, but he wasn't from the right clan. Stop all the nonsense, defense is my defense. Oh yeah. I know the mode is daily dense. Time has passed on, but it's been a million days. We're still ninth and divided, running round in haze. Nothing divided. Nothing divided from the century of the cool cat. Deep down with the cling of the hot hat. Flip that face and then they knocking at my door. I've been feeling the boom since a little after 4. The rest of that core was he really bored? Yo, break out the sword. Let's go cruising in your Ford. Yeah, watch out, yo.